The champagne tasted like ash in Emma's mouth. From across the opulent ballroom, she watched her new husband, Dr. Jonathan Lancaster, the man she had been bound to just 3 hours earlier. He stood alone by a towering floral arrangement, his back to the celebration, his posture rigid. He thought no one was watching, but Emma was. She saw him pull his phone from the pocket of his perfectly tailored tuxedo. His thumb swiped across the screen, and his entire demeanor changed. The cold, arrogant mask he had worn throughout their sham of a ceremony dissolved, replaced by an expression of such profound, unguarded pain that it made Emma's own heart ache in reluctant sympathy. He stared down at the screen, his jaw tight, his eyes filled with a desperate longing. Curiosity overriding her sense of propriety, Emma took a half-step closer, craning her neck just enough to catch a glimpse of the screen's glow. It was a photo. A professionally shot image of a stunningly beautiful model with cascading dark hair and a radiant smile, captured mid-laugh. It was Isabella Croft, the celebrity model whose face was plastered on billboards and magazine covers. The woman Jonathan was supposed to have married. He raised a hand as if to touch the image on the screen, his fingers trembling slightly, before he seemed to remember where he was. With a sudden, sharp movement, he shoved the phone back into his pocket, the cold mask of indifference slamming back into place. He turned, his cool gray eyes scanning the room, and for a brief, chilling moment, they met Emma's. There was no recognition, no shared understanding. It was the look one gives a stranger, or a business asset. Later that night, the charade continued. He escorted her to the penthouse suite of the hotel, a space as grand and impersonal as their wedding had been. He walked her to the door of a lavishly appointed bedroom. "This will be your room," he stated, his voice flat. He then gestured to another door at the far end of the suite. "Mine is over there." The message was clear. This was not a marriage. It was a cohabitation agreement. "Fulfill your role, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, the name sounding foreign and absurd on his lips. "Smile for the cameras, attend the galas, and be a credit to the family name. That is all I ask of you." He turned and walked to his own room without another word, leaving her standing alone in a wedding dress that felt like a costume. The silence he left behind was deafening. Alone, with trembling fingers, Emma unzipped the expensive gown and let it pool at her feet. She pulled out her laptop, the one familiar object in this alien world, and typed his name into the search bar. The screen was instantly flooded with articles, their headlines like a series of brutal blows. Billionaire surgeon Jonathan Lancaster and supermodel Isabella Croft announce engagement. A match made in heaven, inside the Lancaster-Croft wedding plans. And then, the most recent, dated just 2 weeks before her own wedding. Shock split. Lancaster and Croft call off wedding of the century. The truth hit her with the force of a physical impact. She wasn't just a bride of convenience, a pawn in a game of corporate succession. She was a replacement, a placeholder for the woman he truly loved, the woman whose picture he looked at with heartbreaking devotion when he thought no one could see. Desolate, a hollow ache spreading through her chest, she wandered through the silent, opulent suite. Her fingers trailed over the cold marble surfaces, the plush velvet furniture. It was all a beautiful, empty lie. Her eyes landed on a grand piano in a secluded music room overlooking the glittering city. Music had always been her sanctuary. She sat down, her fingers finding the cool ivory of the keys. She didn't play a recognizable song. She just played. A melody emerged, melancholic and searching, a cascade of minor chords that perfectly articulated the crushing loneliness and sense of displacement she felt. The music was her, raw and exposed. She was so lost in the sound that she didn't hear him approach. "That melody," a voice said from the doorway, soft and laced with a gentle sadness. Emma startled, her hands falling from the keys. It wasn't Jonathan. It was his father, Robert Lancaster, a handsome, charismatic man in his mid-40s, with kind eyes that held a hint of the same sorrow her music had just conveyed. He stepped into the room, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "It's beautiful," he continued, his voice a low, soothing balm. It expresses exactly what I have felt in this house for years: loneliness. He looked at her, not as Mrs. Lancaster, the new family acquisition, but as a person. He saw the pain behind her carefully constructed composure. For the first time since she had entered the Lancasters' world, Emma felt truly seen. The instant, unexpected connection with her new father-in-law was a sliver of warmth in the cold, desolate landscape of her new life. Before we continue, tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from right now? I love connecting with our amazing audience from around the world. The next morning, Emma came down to the vast, sun-drenched dining room to find a scene of quiet tension. Jonathan stood by the windows, his back to the room, speaking into his phone. His voice was a low, urgent murmur, a stark contrast to the cold monotone he used with her. "Isabella, please, just listen to me," he was saying, his voice a raw mix of frustration and longing. "It's not what you think. It's a contract, nothing more. No, I can't just walk away. You know the terms. Please, don't hang up." He stopped abruptly, sensing her presence. He turned, and the moment his eyes met hers, the raw emotion vanished, replaced instantly by his familiar, impenetrable mask of cool indifference. He ended the call without another word. "Good morning, Mrs. Lancaster," he said, his voice clipped. "I trust you slept well." The whiplash from his emotional shift was dizzying. Before she could formulate a reply, Robert entered the room, a warm smile on his face that seemed to chase away the chill Jonathan had brought in. "Ah, Emma, good morning," Robert said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He took in the tense atmosphere with a quick, perceptive glance. "Jonathan, you look like you're about to perform a hostile takeover. It's just breakfast." He then turned his full, charming attention to Emma. "The gardens are beautiful this time of morning. After you've eaten, would you do me the honor of joining me for a walk? I'd love to show you my wife's rose garden." The invitation was a lifeline. "I'd love that, thank you, Robert," she said, her gratitude genuine. The contrast between father and son was staggering. The walk with Robert was easy and filled with comfortable conversation. He spoke of his late wife with a gentle, loving nostalgia, pointing out her favorite flowers. He asked Emma about her music, not with polite disinterest, but with genuine curiosity, his questions insightful and engaging. He spoke of art, of literature, of travel. With him, Emma felt her own personality, so long suppressed, begin to re-emerge. She laughed, a real, unforced sound, for the first time in what felt like an eternity. That evening was their first official public appearance, a charity gala for the Lancaster Children's Hospital. Emma wore another stunning gown, feeling once again like an actress in a role she hadn't auditioned for. As soon as they arrived, Jonathan was swarmed by colleagues and board members. He made a perfunctory introduction. "My wife, Emma," before turning his attention to a conversation about surgical robotics, leaving her to stand awkwardly at his side, invisible. Just as the familiar sting of humiliation began to set in, Robert materialized beside her. "Tiresome, isn't it?" he murmured with a conspiratorial wink. "All this talk of profit margins and laser scalpels. Come, let me introduce you to some people who actually know how to have a conversation." For the rest of the evening, Robert was her anchor. He never left her side, drawing her into conversations, proudly introducing her to his friends. "This is my daughter-in-law, Emma," he would say, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "She's a brilliant musician. Has more talent in her little finger than all of us in this room combined." He made her feel seen, valued, and interesting. Under his warm regard, she found herself relaxing, engaging, even enjoying herself. From across the crowded ballroom, Jonathan watched them. He saw his father laughing with his wife. He saw Emma, animated and smiling, looking more vibrant and alive than he had ever seen her. But there was no jealousy in his expression. There was no anger. Instead, there was a flicker of something else, a detached, almost irritated relief. It was the look of a man who was glad someone else was handling a tedious obligation for him. The realization hit Emma with a fresh wave of pain. To Jonathan, she was a duty, a box to be checked. And he was perfectly happy to pass that duty on to his father. She wasn't a wife, or even a partner in their sham marriage. She was a burden. And the kindness she was receiving from Robert, while a balm to her lonely heart, only served to highlight the utter, soul-crushing indifference of the man she had been forced to marry. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with all the warmth of a corporate memo. Jonathan stood in the doorway of the breakfast room, already dressed in a sharp travel suit, his briefcase in hand. "I'll be in Zurich for a medical conference for the next week," he stated, his eyes focused somewhere over her left shoulder. "My schedule is on the shared calendar. Mrs. Davison has all the necessary contact information should an emergency arise." Emma looked up from her coffee, a question forming on her lips. A wife's question. Something about his flight, about his return. But the look on his face stopped her. It was a look of pure, unadulterated indifference. He wasn't leaving a partner behind. He was leaving a piece of furniture. "The house has staff for whatever you might need," he added as an afterthought, as if remembering she existed. And then, he was gone. The silence he left in his wake was vast, but for the first time, it wasn't entirely unwelcome. It was a reprieve. His absence was like a long, slow exhale. The oppressive weight of his cold presence lifted, and the cavernous mansion began to feel less like a prison and more like a space she could actually inhabit. The true transformation, however, came from Robert. With Jonathan gone, the buffer between them disappeared, and their tentative friendship was allowed to blossom into something deeper, something more profound. Their days fell into a comfortable, unspoken rhythm. Mornings were spent in the garden, where Robert would read the paper aloud to her while she sketched the intricate patterns of the flowers his late wife had planted. He had a wonderful reading voice, rich and expressive, and he would pause to debate articles with her, genuinely interested in her perspective. Afternoons were for music. The grand music room, once a place of solitary sadness for Emma, became their shared sanctuary. She would play the piano for hours, not the melancholic dirges of her first night, but soaring, hopeful sonatas. Robert would sit in a worn leather armchair, a glass of wine in hand, and simply listen, his eyes closed, a soft, peaceful smile on his face. He never offered empty praise. Instead, he would discuss the emotional core of the piece, the composer's intent, the way a certain chord progression made him feel. He spoke her language. They discovered a shared love for old black and white films, for rainy afternoons spent in the library surrounded by the scent of old books, for debating philosophy over a game of chess. They laughed. It was a sound Emma hadn't realized she had missed so desperately. His laugh was a warm, genuine rumble that made her feel, for the first time in months, like she was not just an object or an obligation, but a person worthy of joy. She learned about him too. She learned that his marriage to Jonathan's mother had been an arranged one, a union of two powerful families, and that his true love, a university sweetheart, had died tragically before they could be together. He had honored his duty, raised his son, but had lived with a quiet, persistent loneliness ever since. In his story, she saw a painful echo of her own predicament. They were two souls trapped in gilded cages, finding solace in each other's company. The change in her was palpable. The permanent tension in her shoulders eased. A genuine smile replaced the polite, brittle one she wore for public appearances. She felt herself unfurling, like a flower turning toward the sun. And Robert was her son. The seventh day of Jonathan's absence brought with it a torrential, unceasing rain. The sky was a bruised purple, and the world outside the library's massive windows was a blur of gray. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing glow over the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Robert had unearthed a vintage record player and a collection of his wife's old jazz albums. The smoky, soulful voice of Ella Fitzgerald filled the room, a perfect counterpoint to the drumming of the rain. They sat in comfortable silence, sharing a bottle of deep red wine, the firelight playing on their faces. The atmosphere was intimate, charged with a quiet intensity that had been building all week. "It's strange," Robert said, his voice a low murmur that blended with the music. "This house hasn't felt like a home in 20 years. Not since Eleanor passed. It was just a place I lived. But this week it has felt like a home again." He looked at her, his gaze direct and full of a meaning that made her heart skip a beat. "You brought the music back, Emma." Her breath caught in her throat. "You make it easy to play," she whispered, the admission more honest than anything she had said in months. The record ended, leaving only the sound of the fire and the rain. The silence that fell was different. It wasn't comfortable anymore. It was thick with unspoken feelings, with the dangerous, undeniable attraction that had grown between them in the safety of Jonathan's absence. It was a fragile, beautiful, and terrifying thing. "Tell me about your dreams," Robert said softly, his eyes searching hers in the dim light. "Not the ones you have when you sleep, the ones you have for your life." No one had asked her that in years. Under his gentle prompting, she found herself opening up completely. She spoke of her dream to design not just buildings, but spaces that healed, music therapy centers with perfect acoustics, sunlit hospital atriums filled with plants, libraries that felt like sanctuaries. She spoke of her passion with a fire he had never seen in her before, her hands gesturing, her eyes bright with unshed tears of forgotten ambition. He listened, completely captivated. He didn't just hear her words, he understood the soul behind them. "You see the world in music and light," he said, his voice full of awe. "It's a gift." As she spoke, a log in the fireplace shifted, sending a cascade of sparks up the chimney. At the same moment, the lights in the library flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the flickering, intimate glow of the fire. "A power outage," Robert murmured, though neither of them moved. The sudden darkness felt less like an inconvenience and more like a permission slip, erasing the last of the boundaries between them. The world outside, with its rules and its obligations, disappeared. There was only this room, this fire, this music in the silence. He was closer now, though she hadn't seen him move. The scent of his cologne, a subtle mix of sandalwood and old books, enveloped her. The space between them crackled with an energy that was almost painful in its intensity. "Emma," he whispered, his voice hoarse with an emotion he could no longer hide. He reached out, his hand coming up to her face. His touch was impossibly gentle, his thumb stroking the curve of her cheekbone with a reverence that made her tremble. It was not the possessive, claiming touch of his son. It was a touch that asked, that cherished. Her eyes fluttered shut. This was wrong. It was forbidden. He was her father-in-law. But it was also the first time she had felt truly desired, truly seen, since her life had been stolen from her. Her own hand came up to cover his, pressing his palm against her cheek. "Robert!" she breathed, the name a prayer on her lips. He leaned in, his forehead coming to rest against hers. She could feel the soft whisper of his breath, could feel the frantic beating of his heart mirroring her own. The kiss was an inevitability, a conclusion that had been written in every shared glance, every lingering touch, every quiet conversation of the past week. It was a breath away from happening. The moment was shattered by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside. A second later, the headlights of a car swept across the library windows, a harsh, intrusive glare. The power flickered back on, flooding the room with a sterile, unforgiving light. They sprang apart as if they'd been burned, their hands dropping, the intimate spell broken. They stood there, blinking in the sudden brightness, their faces flushed, their breathing ragged. The front door of the mansion opened and closed. Footsteps, sharp and decisive, echoed in the grand hall. Jonathan was home. A day early. He appeared in the doorway of the library, his travel bag still in his hand. He stopped dead, his sharp eyes taking in the scene before him. The two of them, standing too close together in the suddenly bright room. The hastily abandoned wine glasses, the dying fire, the lingering, charged intimacy, that was as palpable as a physical touch. He looked from his father to his wife, his expression completely, terrifyingly unreadable. And in the heavy, suffocating silence, Emma knew that their forbidden refuge had just been discovered. If you're enjoying this story, smash that like button. Every like tells me you want more emotional content like this, and it really helps the channel grow. The silence in the library was a living entity, thick and suffocating. Jonathan stood in the doorway, his gaze sweeping over the scene. The flickering embers of the fire, the 2 wine glasses, the charged space between his wife and his father. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs, bracing for the explosion she was sure was coming. An accusation, a jealous rage, a furious outburst. Instead, what she got was far worse. Jonathan's gaze settled on her, his eyes as cold and clinical as a surgeon's scalpel. There was no anger, no betrayal. There was only a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the kind of mild annoyance one might feel upon discovering a logistical inconvenience. "I see you've been keeping yourselves entertained," he said, his voice flat. He dropped his travel bag by the door and began unbuttoning the cuffs of his shirt. "I trust my father has been a gracious host in my absence." The sheer, dismissive nature of the comment was more insulting than any accusation could have been. He didn't see a potential betrayal. He saw a successful delegation of his duties. Robert, ever the diplomat, stepped forward. "Jonathan, you're home early. We weren't expecting you." "The final keynote was cancelled," Jonathan replied, his attention already drifting to the mail piled on a side table. He didn't look at Emma again. Later that night, after Robert had retired to his own wing, Jonathan summoned Emma to his study. The confrontation she had been dreading was finally here. She walked in, her hands clasped together to stop them from trembling, ready to defend herself, to explain. He was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I hope you and my father are getting along," he began, his back still to her. "It's good that you have found companionship in this house." He turned, and his eyes were devoid of any emotion save for a cold, businesslike authority. "But do not forget your place here, Mrs. Lancaster. Your loyalty, as per our agreement, is to me. Your public role is as my wife. I will not have that role compromised by gossip or impropriety." The accusation was so cold, so corporate, it took her breath away. He wasn't a jealous husband. He was a CEO reprimanding an employee for a potential breach of contract. The pain of it was a sharp, physical blow. All the fear she had felt vanished, replaced by a sudden, white-hot fury. "My loyalty?" she shot back, her voice trembling with a rage she didn't know she possessed. "You dare to speak to me of loyalty? You who spend your nights staring at a picture of another woman on your phone? You whose heart so obviously belongs to someone else?" She had expected him to deny it, to deflect. He did neither. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, his eyes never leaving hers. "My heart," he said, his voice a blade of ice, "was not part of our contract." The brutal honesty of the statement knocked the air from her lungs. "I love Isabella," he continued, stating it as a simple, irrefutable fact. "That is not a secret. I was going to marry her. Circumstances, and my family's demands, prevented that. I married you out of duty to my name and my company. I expect you to honor your side of the bargain with the same sense of duty. Fulfill your role. That is all I require." He was not a monster. He was worse. He was indifferent. She was not a person to him, not a woman, not even a rival to Isabella. She was a line item in a business deal, a placeholder, a ghost in her own marriage. The last shred of hope she had clung to, a tiny, foolish hope that perhaps over time he might come to see her, to care for her, disintegrated. She saw the path forward with a devastating clarity. There would never be a place for her in Jonathan's heart. He had built a fortress around it, and Isabella was the only one with the key. She looked at him, at this handsome, cold, and utterly unavailable man she was legally bound to, and she felt a profound, hollow emptiness. The warmth she had felt in the library with Robert, the feeling of being seen, of being cherished. It was no longer just a pleasant fantasy. It was starting to feel like the only real thing in her life. "I understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper, the fight draining out of her. "Good," he replied, turning back to the window, his dismissal absolute. She walked out of his study, leaving him to his whiskey and his ghosts. She now knew, with absolute certainty, that she was married to a man who would never love her. And she was falling in love with the one man she could never have. In the wake of Jonathan's brutal confession, the mansion became a landscape of quiet, polite misery. Jonathan was a ghost in his own home, his presence fleeting and impersonal. He and Emma moved around each other with the careful, practiced distance of strangers, their interactions limited to curt nods at breakfast and the public performance of a happy couple at the requisite social functions. The only warmth, the only genuine human connection in Emma's life, remained Robert. Their friendship, however, was now tinged with the memory of that charged moment in the library. There was a new awareness between them, a careful dance around the truth of what they felt. They still spent time together, but their conversations were safer, their proximity more measured. The stolen glances lingered a moment too long, and the silence between them was filled with a tension that was both exquisite and agonizing. A week later, Emma discovered from Mrs. Davison that it was Robert's birthday. There were no plans for a celebration. Jonathan was scheduled for a complex 12-hour surgery, and Robert, she learned, hadn't celebrated his birthday in years, not since his wife had passed away. A rebellious, tender impulse took root in Emma's heart. She would not let the day pass unmarked. She spent the entire day conspiring with the household staff, who were all deeply fond of Robert and eagerly joined her plan. She chose a menu of his favorite dishes, selected a rare vintage from the wine cellar she knew he loved, and filled the small, intimate dining room with the scent of jasmine, his late wife's favorite flower. She even found a rare, first-edition book of poetry he had once mentioned wanting. When Robert came down for dinner that evening, expecting another solitary meal, he stopped in the doorway, stunned. The room was bathed in candlelight. The table was set for two, and Emma was standing there, a soft, nervous smile on her face, wearing a simple velvet dress. "Happy birthday, Robert," she said softly. He was speechless. He looked from the beautifully set table to the thoughtful details, his eyes shining with an emotion he hadn't shown before. "Emma," he breathed, his voice thick. "You didn't have to do this." "I wanted to," she said simply. "No one should be alone on their birthday." The dinner was perfect. Free from the oppressive presence of Jonathan and the weight of their usual caution, they talked and laughed with an easy intimacy. They shared the bottle of wine, their conversation flowing from music to memories to dreams for the future. For those few hours, they weren't a daughter-in-law and a father-in-law. They were just a man and a woman, finding a profound and deeply felt connection in each other's company. Robert was more relaxed and open than she had ever seen him. He was funny, charming, and looked at her with an undisguised admiration that made her feel beautiful and cherished. "No one has done something like this for me in years," he confessed, his hand covering hers on the table. "You have brought light back into this house, Emma. Back into my life." The sincerity in his voice, the warmth of his touch, the intoxicating mix of wine and candlelight, it was all too much. The carefully constructed walls they had built around their feelings crumbled. After dinner, he walked her to the door of her wing. They stood there for a moment, unwilling to let the magical evening end. "Thank you, Emma," he said, his voice a low, husky whisper. "For everything." He was standing very close. He raised a hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. His eyes searched hers, full of a year's worth of unspoken longing, of shared lonely moments, of a forbidden, undeniable love. Overwhelmed by the emotion of the night, by the wine, by the profound gratitude he felt for this woman who had seen his loneliness and met it with her own, he did what they had both been silently fighting for weeks. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of explosive passion, like the one she had imagined from Jonathan. It was something far more dangerous. It was tender, hesitant, and filled with a deep, aching sadness. It was a kiss that spoke of shared grief, of impossible timing, of a love that was doomed before it could even begin. It was the gentlest, most heartbreaking kiss she had ever received. They broke apart, both of them breathless and shocked by the enormity of what had just happened. The air between them crackled, the unspoken finally given a voice, a touch. The line had been crossed. They stared at each other wide-eyed, the implications of their actions crashing down on them. They could no longer pretend this was just friendship. They could no longer hide behind their prescribed roles. The kiss had changed everything, and there was no going back. While Emma and Robert were navigating the delicate, dangerous aftermath of their shared kiss, Jonathan was fighting a different battle. The week-long conference in Zurich had been a blur of medical jargon and corporate networking, but his mind had been elsewhere. It was consumed by a single, unscheduled meeting. Isabella had called him. She was in Zurich for a modeling campaign and had seen his name on the conference agenda. She wanted to see him. He had agreed, telling himself it was just to gain closure. They met in a quiet, discreet cafe, away from the prying eyes of the press. The moment he saw her, his carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. She was just as beautiful as he remembered, but there was a new maturity in her eyes, a hint of regret. "I made a mistake, Jonathan," she confessed, her voice soft, her gaze direct. "I let my career, the pressure, all of it, push you away. I let you go too easily. I miss you." Her words were a key turning the lock on a part of his heart he had tried to freeze over. All the feelings he had ruthlessly suppressed came rushing back. The easy laughter, the deep connection, the passionate love. He spent an afternoon with her, and it felt more real, more alive, than the entire 6 months of his cold, contractual marriage to Emma. He realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that he was living a lie. He was sacrificing his own happiness, his one chance at real love. For the sake of a business deal and a family legacy, he wasn't even sure he wanted anymore. He returned to the mansion a day early, his mind made up. He was going to end it. He would find a way to appease his grandfather, to manage the board, but he would not continue to live this hollow existence. He was going to fight for Isabella. As he walked through the quiet house, he began to notice things he had been blind to before. He saw the sheet music left open on the piano, a complex piece he knew Emma played beautifully. He saw a book of poetry by the fireplace, one he knew was his father's favorite, lying next to a half-empty teacup. He saw small signs of a life being lived within the walls of his museum-like home, a life that didn't involve him at all. He walked out into the garden as dusk was settling. And then he saw them. Emma and his father were sitting on a stone bench near the rose garden. They weren't touching. They weren't even talking. But the comfortable silence between them, the way they watched the sunset in perfect, shared contentment, spoke volumes. He saw the genuine, unforced smile on Emma's face as his father pointed out a constellation appearing in the twilight sky. He had expected to feel a flash of anger, of possessiveness. This woman was, by contract, his wife. But he felt nothing of the sort. Instead, a strange, unexpected pang of guilt hit him. He had trapped her. He had brought this vibrant, talented woman into his cold world and sentenced her to a life of loneliness and duty. Seeing her there, looking genuinely peaceful for the first time, he realized that his father had given her something he never could, or would: companionship. In that moment, his decision solidified. Ending the marriage wasn't just for him and Isabella anymore. It was for Emma, too. It was her chance at freedom. He waited until later that night. He found her where he knew she would be, in the music room, her fingers moving silently over the piano keys, not making a sound. She looked up as he entered, her expression guarded, the memory of their last encounter a palpable presence in the room. He didn't waste time with small talk. He walked to the center of the room, his hands in his pockets, a strange seriousness in his eyes. "Emma," he said, his voice even and direct, a surgeon making a clean incision. "We need to talk about the future of this marriage." Emma's hands fell from the piano keys, a silent, discordant chord hanging in the air. She braced herself. After the kiss with Robert, she had been living in a state of quiet dread, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She assumed this was it. Jonathan had seen them, had sensed the shift, and was here to remind her of her duties, to tighten the screws of their cold arrangement. "I'm listening," she said, her voice carefully neutral, her back straight. Jonathan didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room, a man who had come to a resolution. He looked at her directly, and for the first time there was no coldness in his eyes, no indifference. There was only a straightforward, almost weary clarity. "I am ending our marriage," he said. The words were so direct, so blunt, that Emma wasn't sure she had heard him correctly. She had expected threats, accusations, a reinforcement of the rules. Not this. "I saw Isabella in Zurich," he continued, his voice even. "Being with her again, it made me realize that I cannot continue to live this way. It's a lie. It's not fair to me. It's not fair to her, and—" He paused, his gaze softening with a flicker of something that looked almost like regret. "It's not fair to you." He began to pace slowly, a man methodically laying out the terms of a severance. "I have already spoken to my lawyers. We will begin the annulment proceedings immediately, citing irreconcilable differences. It will be quiet and discreet." He stopped and faced her again. "My agreement with your family, however, will remain fully intact. The financial support will continue, indefinitely. Your father's care will be guaranteed for the rest of his life. You fulfilled your part of the bargain, Emma. You gave me the time I needed to secure my position with the board. You are free." He said the word, free, and Emma waited for the wave of humiliation to hit. She had been used, and now she was being discarded. She was the inconvenient wife being swept aside for the real love, the beautiful model. She should have felt like a failure, a footnote in his story. But the humiliation never came. Instead, as his words settled, a strange, profound, and overwhelming sense of relief washed over her. It was a feeling so powerful it almost made her dizzy. Free. The word echoed in her mind, not as an insult, but as a promise. A door had just been unlocked. The cage was open. She looked at Jonathan, at the man who had been her husband, her captor, the source of her misery, and she felt nothing. No anger, no resentment. Only a strange, quiet understanding. He was just as trapped as she had been, in a different kind of cage. "I understand," she said, and the calmness in her own voice surprised her. Jonathan looked taken aback. He had clearly been prepared for tears, for anger, for a scene. Her quiet acceptance seemed to disarm him completely. You understand?" he asked, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. "Yes," she said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. "You love her. You should be with her." She stood up from the piano bench, a newfound sense of lightness in her limbs. "I hope you'll be very happy, Jonathan." She walked past him, heading for the door. Her mind was already racing, not with thoughts of what she had lost, but with the infinite possibilities of what she had just gained. Her freedom. The chance to pursue her music. The possibility of a love that was real, a love that saw her, a love that felt like Robert's gentle touch. "Emma!" Jonathan called out, his voice stopping her at the door. She turned. "For what it's worth," he said, and his expression was one of genuine, unfeigned sincerity. "I am sorry. For all of it." It was the first real apology he had ever given her. "I know," she replied softly. And she did.
She walked out of the music room, leaving him behind, and felt the weight of the Lancaster name, the weight of their loveless contract, fall from her shoulders. She had been discarded, yes, but it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning.
Emma found Robert in the library, a book open in his lap, though he was staring into the crackling fireplace, lost in thought. He looked up as she entered, his face breaking into the warm, familiar smile that had become her only solace. "Emma," he said, his voice full of pleasure. "I was just thinking of you. Come, sit." She didn't sit. She stood before his chair, her hands clasped in front of her, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. "Robert, I have something to tell you." Sensing the seriousness in her tone, his smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What is it? Is everything all right?" "Jonathan is ending our marriage," she said, the words coming out in a quiet rush. "He's going to be with Isabella. He told me tonight. I'm free." Robert stared at her, his expression a whirlwind of emotions. Shock was the first, his eyes widening in disbelief. It was followed by a wave of something else, something he quickly tried to hide, but she saw it clearly in the sudden light that sparked in his eyes. Pure, unadulterated joy. A secret, exultant hope. But just as quickly, that joy was tempered by a shadow of guilt. He looked away from her, toward the fire, his jaw tightening. "I see," he said, his voice strained. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of agitation she had never seen from him before. "I feel I am partly to blame for this. Our proximity, the night of my birthday. Jonathan saw us in here. If he thinks that something happened between us, Emma, I am so sorry. I never meant to jeopardize your position, to cause you this humiliation." "No," Emma said, stepping closer, her voice firm. She knelt by his chair, forcing him to look at her. "Robert, look at me. This had nothing to do with us. Jonathan made this decision for himself and for Isabella. He was honest about it. We were not the cause." Relief washed over his features, but it was quickly replaced by a new, more somber reality. The obstacle of her marriage was gone, but other, more formidable barriers remained. "But what does this mean?" he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You'll be a divorced woman, and I am your ex-husband's father." He let out a short, humorless laugh. "The scandal would be immense. The family, the board, the society pages, they would crucify us. Jonathan's reputation, my own, it would be a disaster." The weight of his words settled in the quiet room. He was right. The conventions of their world were rigid and unforgiving. A relationship between them would be seen as a shocking, unforgivable transgression. He was a Lancaster, the patriarch in waiting, a man bound by duty and legacy. He had spent his life honoring those obligations. Emma looked at him, at this good, honorable man who was already building walls around his own heart for the sake of propriety. She saw him sacrificing his own chance at happiness, just as he had done once before, and she felt a surge of protective fire. She reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "I don't care about the scandal," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that surprised them both. "I have spent the last year of my life living a lie for the sake of my family, for the sake of contracts and appearances. I will not spend the rest of my life living another lie for fear of what other people will think." She held his gaze, her heart in her eyes. "My only question, Robert, is for you." She paused, letting the weight of her next words fill the space between them. "Do you care?" Robert stared at her, his mind reeling. "Do you care?" The question was a perfectly aimed arrow, piercing through decades of carefully constructed defenses, duty, propriety, legacy, grief. It was the most terrifying and liberating question he had ever been asked. For 20 years, since the death of his first and only true love, he had lived his life in shades of grey. He had fulfilled his obligations, raised his son, managed his family's empire, all with a quiet, dignified resignation. He had forgotten what it felt like to want something for himself, something that wasn't dictated by his name or his position. And then Emma had walked into his life. She was a splash of vibrant color in his monochrome world. He had been drawn to her at first out of pity, seeing in her the same trapped loneliness he felt in himself. But pity had quickly transformed into admiration for her resilience, her talent, her quiet strength. Admiration had then deepened into a profound affection, a connection of two souls who spoke the same language of art and quiet sorrow. And affection, in the stolen moments in the library and the music room, had ignited into a love so powerful and so forbidden it had shaken him to his core. He had fought it. He had told himself it was inappropriate, that he was merely a father figure to her, that his feelings were a projection of his own loneliness. But the kiss on his birthday had shattered that illusion. It was real. And now her marriage was over. A path was clearing, a path he had never dared to imagine. But it was a path surrounded by thorns, the scandal, the judgment, the potential damage to the family name he had spent his life upholding. He looked at her, kneeling before him, her eyes shining with a fearless, hopeful light. She was offering him a choice he hadn't realized he had. A choice between the duty he had always known and the happiness he had long since given up on. Yes, he finally whispered, the admission torn from him, raw and honest. God help me, Emma. Yes, I care. I care about the scandal. I care about what this would do to Jonathan, to my family. I have spent my entire life putting this family first. Emma's face fell, the light in her eyes dimming. She began to pull her hand away, a silent acceptance of his rejection. But he tightened his grip, refusing to let her go. But, he continued, his voice gaining a strength she had never heard before, a voice that was no longer resigned, but resolute. For the first time in a very long time, I think I care about something more. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I care more about the thought of you walking out of that door and never coming back. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The days that followed were a strange, secret dance. Jonathan, true to his word, had his lawyers begin the annulment process, and he treated Emma with a new, respectful distance. He was a man focused on his own second chance, and he seemed oblivious to the quiet revolution happening under his own roof. For Emma and Robert, it was a time of stolen moments and whispered conversations. They were charting a new, unknown territory, their feelings for each other now an acknowledged truth, but their future still a terrifyingly blank page. Finally, the day came. The annulment was finalized. Emma was no longer Mrs. Lancaster. She was Emma Collins again. The realization was both liberating and daunting. She was free, but she was also homeless, her future uncertain. She knew she could not stay in that house. It was a matter of principle, of reclaiming her own life. She began to pack. It was a symbolic act. She folded the simple clothes she had arrived with, placing them in the same worn suitcase. She left behind the entire wardrobe of designer gowns and jewels, the gilded trappings of her contractual life. She was shedding the skin of Mrs. Lancaster, and it felt like breathing for the first time in a year. She was zipping the suitcase when Jonathan appeared in the doorway of her room. He leaned against the frame, his hands in his pockets, an uncharacteristically hesitant look on his face. "So, you're really leaving," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have to," she replied softly. "It's time for me to find my own way." "Where will you go?" he asked, a hint of genuine concern in his voice. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I'll figure it out. I always do." A long silence stretched between them, no longer awkward or cold, but filled with a strange, quiet respect. They were two people who had been bound by a contract, who had caused each other pain, but who had, in the end, inadvertently set each other free. My offer of financial support still stands, Emma, he said. You don't have to struggle. I know, she said, giving him a small, grateful smile. But I need to do this for myself. At least for a while. I understand. He pushed himself off the doorframe. Be happy, Emma, he said, his voice full of a sincerity that touched her. He turned to leave, but paused. And my father, he's a good man. He's been lonely for a very long time. You brought something back to life in him. In this whole house. He gave her one last, long look, a look of understanding and farewell. And then he was gone. Emma stood in the middle of the room, her suitcase packed, her heart a tangled mess of sadness for what was ending, and a thrilling, terrifying hope for what might begin. She took a deep breath, ready to take her first step into her new, unknown life. Don't go. The voice came from the doorway. Robert stood there, his face pale, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading emotion. He looked at her packed suitcase, and a look of profound loss crossed his features. Or, he said, his voice cracking as he took a step into the room, if you must go, then take me with you. Emma stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. I can't stay in this house without you, Emma, he confessed, his voice raw with a vulnerability she had never seen. It will go back to being what it was before you came, a beautiful, empty mausoleum. I'll go back to being who I was, a ghost haunting its halls. You said you didn't care about the scandal. For a week, I've been trying to convince myself that I do, that my duty, my name, my son, should matter more. He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to cup her face, his gaze intense and unwavering. But I was wrong. None of it matters if you're not here. The only thing that matters is you. He searched her eyes, his soul laid bare. I love you, Emma. I think I have from the moment I heard you playing that sad, beautiful song in the music room. It was the sound of my own heart, and I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Tears streamed down Emma's face as she leaned into his touch. This was it, the moment of truth, the choice that would define the rest of her life. So I am asking you, he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. Stay, and we will face the world together right here, or leave, and we will build a new world just for us, somewhere else. But let's be together. Please, Emma, choose us. He held out his hand, his palm open, waiting. It was a promise, a plea, the beginning of a future she had never dared to imagine. She looked from his outstretched hand to his loving, hopeful face. The fear was still there, a faint tremor in the back of her mind. But the love she felt for him was a roaring fire, burning away all the doubt, all the pain, all the loneliness of the past year. She had been forced into a marriage with a Lancaster, only to find her true home with another. With a watery, brilliant smile, she placed her hand in his. Together, she whispered. Their clasped hands were a silent pact, a declaration made in the quiet of the sunlit room. The first step, they both knew, was to face Jonathan. Not as a son or a father or as an ex-husband and a new suitor, but as three adults whose lives were now irrevocably intertwined. They found him in his study, staring at a blueprint on his desk. He looked up as they entered, his eyes immediately falling to their joined hands. He showed no surprise, no shock. There was only a quiet, weary resignation, as if he were looking at the inevitable conclusion of a complex equation he had long been trying to solve. I see, he said, his voice calm. Jonathan, Robert began, his voice firm, his grip on Emma's hand tightening. Emma and I, we love each other. We intend to build a life together. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying them for a long moment. He looked at his father, truly looked at him, and saw not the stoic patriarch, but a man alive with a hope he hadn't seen in decades. He looked at Emma, the woman he had married out of duty, and saw not a pawn, but a woman who had found her own path to happiness, even if it was the most unconventional one imaginable. A slow, small smile touched Jonathan's lips. It was not a smile of mockery, but of a strange, unexpected peace. He had spent his life chasing a ghost, and in doing so, had created two more. Now, it seemed, they were all finally finding their way into the light. "I suppose," he said, his voice laced with a dry, self-aware irony, "that we all deserve to be happy, no matter how complicated the route." He stood up and extended a hand, not to his father, but to Emma. "Be happy, Emma." She took his hand, shaking it firmly. "You too, Jonathan." It was a final, peaceful transfer, a blessing, an act of liberation for all three of them. Robert and Emma decided they would not hide. Their love was not something to be ashamed of, and they would not begin their new life cowering in the shadows. The annual Lancaster Foundation Gala was a week later, the perfect and most public stage to announce their new reality. When they walked into the grand ballroom, a hush fell over the crowd. The sight of Dr. Robert Lancaster, the respected family patriarch, holding hands with Emma, the woman who, until a week ago, had been his daughter-in-law, was so shocking it was like a physical blow. A wave of whispers rippled through the room, a chorus of disbelief and scandalized judgment. "Can you believe the audacity? She went from the son to the father? What a predator. Poor Jonathan, how humiliating." Emma felt a tremor of fear, the old insecurity creeping back in. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, dissecting her, judging her. But then Robert squeezed her hand, his touch a warm, steady anchor in the storm. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Let them talk," he whispered, his voice a low, confident murmur. "Their opinions are meaningless. The only thing that matters is right here." He smiled at her, a smile so full of love and unwavering support that all her fear melted away. She smiled back, a radiant, defiant smile, and lifted her chin. They were not ashamed. They were in love. They moved through the room as a united front, greeting acquaintances with a calm, dignified grace that offered no apology and no explanation. They ignored the whispers, faced the stares head-on, and in their quiet, unshakable unity, they projected a power that slowly silenced the gossip. They didn't stay long. They had made their statement. After an hour, Robert turned to her. "Have you seen enough of this circus?" "More than enough," she laughed. They left the party, walking out of the grand ballroom and into the cool night air, leaving the scandal and the whispers behind them. As the car pulled away, Emma looked back at the glittering hotel, a symbol of the world she was so gladly leaving behind. "Are you sure about this, Robert?" she asked softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "Giving all that up?" He turned to her, his eyes serious and full of a profound love. "Emma, I'm not giving anything up," he said, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm finally gaining everything." Their freedom, they both knew, was more important than any legacy. If you love stories that make you feel something real, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. I post new emotional stories every week that will keep you hooked from start to finish. They didn't run away. They didn't hide. In a move that shocked the high society that had been so quick to condemn them, Robert and Emma chose to stay. But they did not stay in the cold, cavernous Lancaster mansion, a place haunted by too many ghosts of their former lives. A week after the gala, Robert, with a quiet finality, packed a few personal belongings, handed the keys to the household staff over to a surprised but understanding Jonathan, and walked out of the house he had lived in for over 30 years without a single look back. Their new home was a charming, historic brownstone in a quieter, greener part of the city. It was a house with character, with worn wooden floors that creaked, with a slightly overgrown garden in the back, and with a magnificent bay window in the living room that was perfect for a grand piano. It was a house that felt alive, a stark contrast to the sterile, museum-like quality of the Lancaster estate. The process of making it their own was a joyful act of creation. The first piece of furniture to arrive was Emma's piano, which Robert had arranged to be moved from the mansion. He stood back and watched as she sat down and played for the first time in their new home. The music that filled the empty rooms was not the melancholic sound of her loneliness, nor the hesitant notes of her secret friendship. It was a bold, complex, and soaring melody. Full of the promise of a future she was finally free to compose for herself. Their life together fell into a rhythm that was as natural as breathing. It was a life built on small, shared intimacies. It was waking up together in a sun-drenched bedroom, his arm draped protectively around her. It was the scent of coffee he brewed for her every morning, just the way she liked it. It was the comfortable silence as they read side by side in the evenings, her feet tucked under his legs on the sofa. Robert, for the first time, was not just the CEO of Harrington Medical or the Lancaster family patriarch. He was just Robert. He shed the bespoke suits for comfortable sweaters and jeans. He rediscovered his passion for cooking, and their small kitchen was often filled with the scent of garlic and herbs and the sound of their easy laughter. He watched Emma with a kind of quiet awe, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. He would find her lost in her music, her entire being focused on the keys, and a look of such profound love would cross his face that it would take her breath away. For Emma, it was a revelation. She was loved not for a role she was playing, but for exactly who she was. Robert cherished her talent, celebrated her intelligence, and soothed her insecurities. He set up a music studio for her on the top floor of the brownstone, a beautiful room with perfect acoustics and a view of the garden. He encouraged her to start composing again, not just playing the works of others, but creating her own. "You have a symphony inside you, Emma," he told her one evening, his hand covering hers on the piano keys. "The world deserves to hear it." Under his unwavering belief in her, she began to flourish. The tentative, fearful woman who had walked into a loveless marriage disappeared, replaced by a confident, vibrant artist. She started giving private lessons to gifted children from underprivileged backgrounds, her heart filling with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt since the days before her family's ruin. Of course, the outside world did not simply vanish. There were still whispers, still cold shoulders at the few social events they chose to attend. But it was different now. The judgment of others was a distant, meaningless noise. Their home was a sanctuary, their love a shield. They had built a world for themselves that was so full of warmth and genuine happiness that the coldness of high society couldn't touch them. One crisp autumn afternoon, about 6 months after they had moved into the brownstone, an invitation arrived. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the calligraphy elegant and understated. Emma's breath caught as she read it. It was an invitation to the wedding of Jonathan Lancaster and Isabella Croft. She handed it to Robert, a knot of complex emotions tightening in her chest. It was a final, formal closing of a chapter of her life. Robert read the invitation, his expression calm. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, always so attuned to her feelings. "We don't have to go if you don't want to," he said softly. "No," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I think we should." She looked around their beautiful sunlit living room, at the sheet music scattered on the piano, at the half-finished painting on an easel in the corner, at the life they had built together. There were no ghosts here. "I think it's important." Robert understood. This wasn't about Jonathan or Isabella. It was about them. It was about showing up to the world not as a scandalous secret, but as a happy, committed couple, secure in their own love story. It was about celebrating the fact that everyone, in the end, had found their way to their own version of happiness. "All right," he said, his own smile matching hers. He took the invitation and placed it on the mantelpiece, a place of honor. "Let's go celebrate all kinds of love, especially ours." A few weeks later, as they were getting ready for a quiet dinner out, Emma felt a sudden wave of dizziness. She gripped the back of a chair, taking a deep breath. "Emma, are you all right?" Robert asked, instantly by her side, his hand on her back, his face etched with concern. "I'm fine," she said, though a strange, new, and utterly impossible thought was beginning to dawn in her mind. Just a little lightheaded. The feeling passed, but the thought remained. The next day, her hands trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilarating hope, she took a test. She sat on the edge of their bathtub, watching the small window, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Robert could hear it from downstairs. 2 pink lines appeared, stark and undeniable. She was pregnant. She walked downstairs in a daze, the test clutched in her hand. Robert was in the living room, reading by the fire. He looked up as she entered, his brow furrowing with concern at her pale, shocked expression. "My love, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't speak. She simply walked over to him and held out the test. He took it, his eyes scanning the small window. He looked at it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he slowly looked up at her, and his face was transformed by a look of such pure, unadulterated joy that it brought tears to her eyes. He stood up, pulling her into his arms and lifting her off the ground, spinning her around in a circle. He was laughing, a deep rumbling sound of pure happiness that filled the entire house. "A baby," he whispered, his forehead pressed against hers, his own eyes shining with tears. "We're having a baby, Emma. Our baby." She had entered the Lancaster family through a contract designed to secure a legacy, a loveless union meant to produce an heir for the wrong man. Now, she was here, in a home filled with love and music, about to have a child with the right man, a child conceived not from duty, but from a deep and abiding love. It was the ultimate, most beautiful irony. She had been forced to marry a Lancaster to save her family, only to find her true family and her truest self with another. This child wouldn't be just a Lancaster. It would be a symbol of their new beginning, a testament to a love that had defied all expectations and broken all the rules. A year later, Emma found herself standing in another garden, at another wedding. But this time, she was not the bride, nor was she a pawn in a painful charade. She was a guest, a friend, and her hand rested securely in Robert's, his other arm wrapped protectively around her, his hand resting on the gentle swell of her pregnant belly. The wedding of Jonathan and Isabella was nothing like the cold corporate affair that had been Emma's. It was a joyful, sun-drenched celebration, filled with genuine laughter and happy tears. Isabella was radiant in a simple, elegant gown, and Jonathan was a man Emma barely recognized. The cold, arrogant mask was completely gone, replaced by an open, unabashed adoration as he looked at his new wife. He looked happy, truly happy. As Jonathan and Isabella walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, their eyes found Emma and Robert in the crowd. There was no awkwardness, no lingering resentment. Jonathan gave them a small, sincere nod of acknowledgement, a gesture of peace. Isabella offered a warm, genuine smile. It was a quiet, mutual recognition that their strange, tangled paths had, against all odds, led them all to the right place. During the reception, Jonathan approached them, Isabella on his arm. "Emma, Robert," Jonathan said, his tone easy and relaxed. "I'm glad you came." "It was a beautiful ceremony, Jonathan," Robert replied, shaking his son's hand. "We're very happy for you both." "Thank you, Dad," Jonathan said, the words carrying a new weight of mutual respect. Isabella turned to Emma, her eyes kind. "Your music for the processional was breathtaking, Emma. Everyone was talking about it." Emma had composed a piece for their wedding, a gift. It was a melody full of hope, of second chances, of love found in unexpected ways. "I'm so glad you liked it," Emma said, smiling. The four of them stood there for a moment, two couples whose lives had been so dramatically intertwined. They were not a traditional family, but they were a family nonetheless, bound by a broken contract and the shared, complex history that had ultimately set them all free. Later, as the party continued, Emma and Robert found a quiet bench away from the music, overlooking a serene lake. He wrapped his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting on her belly, where their child gently kicked. "Who would have thought," she murmured, looking at the happy couple on the dance floor, "that a loveless marriage could lead to so much love?" Robert smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I think," he said softly, "that love was there all along. It was just waiting for the right people to find it." The legacy of the Lancaster name, once a rigid construct of duty and expectation, was being redefined. It was no longer just about a powerful man and his heir. It was now a story of two families, two love stories, born from the ashes of a broken arrangement. Emma, who had been forced to marry a Lancaster to save her family, had not only found her own happiness, but had inadvertently created a path for everyone else to find theirs. She had entered their world as a substitute, a placeholder, but had become a catalyst for change, for truth, and for a more authentic kind of love. She looked up at Robert, at his kind eyes and loving smile, and felt a wave of profound gratitude. Their future was a blank page, a new composition waiting to be written. And she knew, with every fiber of her being, that it would be a symphony.